Hey everybody, Professor Benelou here with the second of two short videos explaining Unit 4 discussion board. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to discuss the 4 different topics that you can choose from. Remember, you're analyzing a primary document once again, and you have the list listed in the assignment. Once again, a primary document is a document that was written during an era of history that you are studying. So we're going over the 1980s and early 1990s in Unit 4. And basically the first primary document you can cover is an article, which is an interview with President Reagan on the signing of the Tax Equity and Responsibility Act of 1982. So to really understand the document, you have to have a little background information on Reaganomics. Reaganomics, when Reagan was sworn into office in January 1981, 40 years ago, the economy was suffering from slow economic growth that had plagued both Ford and Carter. Reagan wanted to increase the amount of spending money every American had in his or her pocket. So he instituted an economic program that the press dubbed Reaganomics. The cornerstone of Reaganomics is basically the belief that if you cut taxes for the wealthy, the wealth would trickle down to the lower and middle classes. Reagan was a huge fan of smaller government, and he felt that the middle class would benefit from simpler tax codes. He cut about $41 billion from the federal budget, which is quite a bit. Unfortunately, much of that was to the detriment of social programs. Supply-side economics is a factor of Reaganomics. It's the belief that cutting taxes for big business will cause the wealth to trickle down to lower and middle classes. The Tax Equity and Responsibility Act, remember, Reagan is interviewed upon signing this into law, okay? So very important to keep track of this law. It closed tax loopholes and restricted benefits in pension plans. This was Reagan's way of trying to pay off the national debt without raising taxes. It helped out somewhat, but not as much as had been hoped. The gap between the rich and the poor grew during Reagan's years in office. He was in office from 1981 to 1989. Reagan did not increase the minimum wage during his time in office, and during his time in office, he cut funding for the firefighters, policemen, and education. That was all cut during his 8 years as president. Single mother and African American households saw the biggest decline in income during Reagan's presidency. And in 1984, Reagan further slashed the tax rates for the wealthy, which caused an even larger national debt. And that's basically because he was so focused on funding the military and, of course, funding his beloved SDI or Star Wars program. Okay. The second primary document you can choose from is a speech President George H.W. Bush gave before the United Nations General Assembly October 1st, 1990. So to understand this speech, you need to have a background on the first Gulf War. August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded and took over Kuwait. Kuwait is a very oil-rich nation. Supposedly, the Iraqis took over Kuwait because they were saying that the Iraqis were siphoning oil from an area that was supposed to be shared by both nations and what have you. Anyway, President Bush immediately demanded the withdrawal of Iraqi forces. Saudi Arabia, what you got to understand, everybody, is the United States was the head of United Nations coalition forces. And United Nations coalition forces were based in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis allowed us to be the base for the troops. Saudi Arabia allowed their nation to be the base for the United Nations coalition troops because Saudi Arabia is also a very oil-rich nation. And the Saudis figure, well, heck, if they're taking over oil-rich nations, the Iraqis are taking over oil-rich nations, we're going to be next. Saddam Hussein dared to invade and take over Kuwait. Saddam Hussein was the leader of Iraq. He dared instigate the invasion and take over Kuwait because the U.S. had always been allies of Iraq, and he felt that we wouldn't intervene if he invaded and took over Kuwait. Coalition forces quickly liberated Kuwait and headed into Iraq. Even though the coalition forces won the war, Saddam Hussein remained in power until 2003. It's interesting because a lot of people criticize former President George H.W. Bush for allowing Saddam Hussein to remain in power. But you have to think of it this way, folks. The Middle East has always been an unstable area of the world. If you had taken Saddam Hussein out of power in 1991, you would have created a power vacuum which would have made an already unstable area of the world even more so. Okay, so in terms of the primary document, President George H.W. Bush gave the speech in front of the United Nations General Assembly on October 1st, 1990. This speech occurred a mere 2 months after the Iraqi invasion and takeover of Kuwait. Within the speech, Bush condemned the Iraqi aggression and called on members of the UN to demand a return of Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. He said that the United Nations can aid nations to band together to prevent aggression and punish those responsible. Okay, so the third topic that you can get into is the tear down this wall speech. Reagan was known as the great communicator, and for very good reason. He was an incredible speech giver. And remember, Reagan came to fame in the United States as an actor, so his acting training really paid off as far as speech giving goes. Reagan gave this famous speech at the Berlin Wall, in June of 1987. During this speech, he urged an end to the Cold War and said he dreamed of democracy spreading to the nations under communist rule. And he emphasized the hardships endured by Berliners since the wall had been built in 1961. So basically, you have to understand the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall to really get into the tear down this wall speech. So the dismantling of the wall began in November 1989 when the East German government collapsed. The communist East German government collapsed. The economy in East Germany was on the decline for quite some time. Soviet Premier Gorbachev urged East Germans to impose economic reforms like he did in the Soviet Union with perestroika and glasnost. Many East Germans were flocking to embassies wanting to be let into West Germany. November 1989, East German leader Erich Honecker resigned and East Germans were let into West Germany. Okay, so the fourth and last topic, the primary document is a YouTube video. And the YouTube video is news footage of the stock market crash of 1987, which was known as Black Monday or October 19, 1987. The values of stocks plummeted an incredible 20%. Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, tried to slash interest rates to prevent the crash from becoming worse. Before the crash in 1987, the stock market had been booming, and stock market trading via the computer became popular, especially program trading. This was large volume stock trading over the computer. And state pension funds and large institution funds usually put in automatic stock orders. Index arbitrage is traders using computers to determine when a stock's price will be low enough to make a wise purchase. Because remember, everybody, when you're dealing with the stock market, you want to buy low and you want to sell when high, okay? So that's how you make money. Before the stock market crash, interest rates were rising and the U.S. trade deficit was growing. October 18, 1987, investors held off buying, which triggered a program trade. Program trade is automatic buying or selling from large institutions. The sell-offs that resulted from the program trade led to calling in of margin loans. Margin loans is buying using stock as credit. Margin calls is calling in a loan that uses stock as collateral. There were so many margin calls that few investors had enough money to plow back into the market, and this caused the crash. All right, everybody, those are the 4 topics that you can choose from. Each one is very interesting and has a ton of research information out there. So remember, choose the primary document that you feel interests you the most and go for it. And of course, as always, I am here for you for questions. Message me through the CTU app or email me through my email address and I will get back to you. All right, everybody, be diligently working on this and good luck.